So there's this story, and just anytime you ever hear me speak, I'm going to start with a story and throw some jokes in there. But so if they're not that funny, just give me a pity laugh, please. And so there's this story about this man. He's going to do this study on churches across America. And so he has, the bright idea, I'm going to start all the way out west. And so he's going to go all the way out to California, and he's going to study the churches across America. And so he gets all the way out into California out west, and he comes to the very first church, and he sort of enters the atrium of that church, and kind of right there in the middle, he sees kind of sitting on a podium a golden telephone. And next to this golden telephone, the man sees a little card right there. It says $10,000 a minute. And so if anybody here ever saw, some extreme price like that, $10,000 a minute, you'd probably ask some questions. And sure enough, he goes and he finds the preacher of that church, and he asks, well, why is this phone call to use this phone so expensive? And the preacher says, well, you don't understand. This is a direct line to God. And so that is why it's so expensive. You got to get the wires all the way up there and everything like that. So it's $10,000 a minute to talk to God. And so the man's just, kind of floored by this, but, he continues on his way, and he's going to go about his study, and he makes his way from out west all the way out east, and he finally gets to Alabama. And so he gets to Alabama, and he decides to come into this church of Alabama. He walks into the atrium, and sure enough, there on a little podium is a golden telephone. But next to this telephone, it has $1 a minute. And so this was a change from all the other telephones this man has seen. And so he goes and he finds the preacher of this church, and he says, well, mister, how come this phone is so much cheaper than all the other golden telephones I've seen across the U.S.? And he gets next to the preacher, and the preacher puts his arm around him. He says, son, you're in Alabama now. It's a local call. So, there are a lot of great questions in life. And perhaps we might wish we had a telephone, or we can make a call to talk directly to God, and sort of, how we can just up and call our parents, or our siblings, or our spouses. And there are three questions we sort of ask in our lives a lot, and we may ask them a lot, but we sort of avoid answering them a lot as well. And these are, where did I come from, why am I here, and where I'm going? Well, oftentimes, when we finally get where we're going, we often realize the path to that location could have been a little bit easier if we had only made some different choices. If we had only had that direct call to God, we could have made some different decisions and acted a little bit differently. And this particularly seems to be the case in our Christian lives. When we look back in this, that 20/20 hindsight on our lives, if we would have just made different decisions, things could have been a whole lot easier. If only we had had more faith in God and how He has called us to live our Christian lives. And so tonight, we're going to talk about our calling and how we have all been called. And so God has all called us, and so it's whether we pick up the phone or not. So number one, we have all been called. Well, have you ever had a calling in your life before? Perhaps some of you think your occupation or the things you are pursuing in school, or just anything that your hobbies, whether it's fishing or hunting, or you might play tennis, or you might just do something else, and you might think that is my calling in life. That I seem to excel at that, or I seem to just really enjoy it. And we can look at sort of people in our popular culture today and really say that this person has found the calling in their life. We could look at sort of the great athletes or great examples. You might could look at LeBron James and say that man was called to play basketball because he is so great at it. We could look at some of the smartest people here on our earth today, that Bill Gates was called to work on computers because of the success he has had. And so I ask you here tonight, do you think you have found your calling? And some of you are probably thinking about work the next morning, and you're saying probably not. And so oftentimes we can just sort of look around and we can think that others have found their calling, but it doesn't always seem to work like that in our lives. However, God still calls us today. No, not a voice in the sky like you might think out, like sort of like that picture of Mufasa in The Lion King where he calls out to Simba. Not sort of that. You're not going to get that grand voice in the sky that's going to talk to you. But through His Word, we are called to live a life after the pattern of Christ and devote ourselves to His teachings in the inspired Word of the apostles. So we all have a calling to live as Christ-like examples. And we are all being called home. In John 14, verse 2, it says, "My Father's house has many rooms, and if it were not so, would I have not told you I'm going there for you to be with me also where I am." We are all being called home, and Christ would not have told us that if He didn't know that rooms were waiting for us. And so, God often calls you from unexpected and different or strange places in your life, something you might not have expected. And tonight, we're going to be looking at Abraham and his calling and how that relates to our lives. You see, God promised Abraham 7 things, 7 great promises. He promised Abraham that He would make of him a great nation, that He would bless him, that He would make His name great, that He Himself would be a blessing to others, and that He would bless those who bless Him, curse those who curse Him, and that through Abraham, God would bless all the families of the earth. And so this seems like a pretty great set of blessings. And you're probably thinking, how could anyone mess this up? If you're virtually told that you are going to be great, that God is going to work through you, you might think, how could you mess this up? We have sort of those moments in our lives too, where we look back in that hindsight and we think, how could we have messed that up? How could we have had those I'm so stupid moments? Well, Abraham was from the city of Ur, and Ur was a polytheistic culture, and it was sort of situated next to the Euphrates River. And while it was not a large city in terms of its geographical size, it had a pretty great and substantial population of about 300,000, so not too far off from around Montgomery. During Abraham's lifetime, it had that population. However, one of the more significant facts that I relate to you is that it had this polytheistic culture, and that means it worshiped multiple gods. However, most prominent of these was the moon god Nannar, and they had virtually a god for everything that you could imagine. Just as like you might think of Greek, Roman mythology, just a god for everything that just sort of suits your fancy. And so in this city where virtually everything went from a religious standpoint, Abraham is called forth. And Abraham's calling from this culture is a prime example of how God's calling to worship Him as the true and only God is full of both mercy and forgiveness. And so Ur is not too far off from our culture today. Yes, we have advanced from just a technological standpoint and many other standpoints, but we have sort of this religious culture where everything just seems to go, where we just let anything slide from a religious standpoint when we follow our calling. And you're sort of free to worship however you might like, and yet God still, just like Abraham out of that city, continues to call us. And even today, He is still full of mercy and grace. However, Abraham, when he left that city of Ur, he didn't follow the call all the way. Just like some of you might not, when you have your goals, you might not complete it all in one swoop. But Abraham and his family and his father left the city of Ur, and they went about 600 miles from their destination of Canaan, and they stopped in the city of Haran. And we can see that God will still continue to call you. You see, people oftentimes like to run away from their calling when they see the great effort or the work that it will take. But God will still continue to call you, and you have the opportunity to pick up that task anytime. And so oftentimes we could be like Jonah, where we're sort of scared and we only want to do sort of a half effort, or we want to run away like him. And so we want to half obey as well in our own lives. And we only want to give up a few things. when following our calling. But we have to remember that Jesus paid it all, and all to him I owe. So we cannot give him a half effort. You see, God called Abraham to leave his culture, and he called him to sort of leave his, sort of extended family there, and God called him to go to that designated place of Canaan. You see, Abraham had to rely on a great God when he was told to leave, and he was only able to do so because he had a great faith. You see, our actions alone do not dictate our eternal destination, but it's only through our faith in God and the actions that we take that flow from our faith which lead us on our calling to our promised land. Our faith in the Word is our compass. It is a lamp unto our feet to direct our paths. And we know that we can follow the Word and the truth that God has spoken to us because we trust in a known God who knows our future. You see, Abraham's actions are meaningless. Him following that calling is meaningless unless he had faith in that calling. And we are in the same boat. Unless we have a solid faith in our calling, then our actions are meaningless. We are simply confusing morality with a Christian lifestyle. And so, on our path of our calling back home, we are sometimes called, and there might be setbacks or obstacles to overcome. There might be setbacks or obstacles to overcome. And we can see this in Abraham's life. Soon after Abraham left and he made it to his destination, his goal, and he got to Canaan. He arrived in Canaan's land. There arose this great famine. And he had to leave and he had to pick up everything he had already established, and he had to go down to Egypt because the famine was so severe. And so can you imagine for a moment how perplexed Abraham was? That he has listened to God's direct calling. He's physically talked to God, and he's arrived in the promised land. I've been following my calling, but yet I have to leave so soon. He was probably thinking, I'm here in the promised land, so why am I having to leave? Isn't God going to keep his promise? I've done what he's asked, so what is the issue? You see, often when we are calling, we think everything will sort of go according to plan. We think that if we just do what is right in our everyday lives, that we'll just go home to our calling and just have the best of time, and everything will just be great. And we often use the sort of the phrase that we are on the straight and narrow when we're following that calling to go home. But the Bible says this in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 14. It says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." You see, we say that straight and narrow, and we can see from that passage that the Bible does call it a narrow path, because few stay on it. But it never calls it straight, because hardly is our path to our calling back home straight. Our call is often on a winding path that often seems to double back on itself, and sometimes we wonder if we're even going in the right direction. And this is probably how Abraham felt when he had to go to Egypt. He probably thought, well, I seem to be out of sorts on what to do. I seem to be going in the opposite direction. Whereas what often sort of happens in these types of situations, we begin to rely on our own strength. And so Abraham began to rely on his own strength and not on God. And we begin to think, just like Abraham, that we can solve our own problems. You see, instead of just trusting God and thinking that everything will be okay, Abraham began to worry that he would get into some form of trouble that God would not be able to deliver him from. And so when he got down to Egypt, he realized that his wife Sarah was a beautiful woman, and he feared that that might put him in some sort of situation where it could threaten his life. And so Abraham had the bright idea to just say that, well, Sarah is just my sister, sort of a half-truth, if you kind of know the genealogy there. It's sort of a half-truth. And he tries to tell everybody, Sarah is just my sister, and so he wouldn't have to put his life on the line. And so Abraham lies, and he tells Sarah to lie to everyone that inquired that she was just his sister, and that it was because of this lie that Sarah is actually taken away and given to Pharaoh in Egypt because of her beauty. However, God began to plague Pharaoh because of what has occurred. He began to plague his household, and it became apparent that these plagues were because of Sarah. And so Pharaoh delivered back Sarah unto Abraham, and he virtually just kicked him out of Egypt and told him just to leave and go on somewhere. And because Abraham and his lie were found out, they were made to leave and have to go back to that area that was suffering from that famine. And so you think that Abraham would have learned from this, that he would have learned that, I can't take everything into my own hands when I'm following my calling, that I have to rely on God and that He will deliver me. Well, Abraham again enters in sort of a similar situation, and he once again lies and says that Sarah is his sister to King Abimelech. So once again he lies, and he sort of forces this situation where Abimelech is too plagued and his household is plagued because he has taken Sarah away, and Abraham is sort of forced into this sort of promise or contract where that him and Abimelech were sort of just leave each other alone. And this is once again showing that Abraham is trying to take things into his own hands instead of relying upon God. You see, just like Abraham, we often don't learn from our mistakes, and we continue to do the same things over and over again when we're following our calling. And so we make these repeated efforts and attempts by us when we begin to realize that our strength alone is insufficient in responding to the heavenly call. It is clear that when we rely on our strength and intelligence alone, that things don't always tend to work out. And sure, it may seem like things are going your way every once in a while, and that may actually be the case. But as always the case, things will always turn out for better in the end if we follow God and His calling back home. We can look back on almost any decision we regret making and say, if I had just done the right thing, things wouldn't have turned out the way they have, and I wouldn't be where I'm at. If I had just had faith in God, then things wouldn't have turned out like they did. You see, in Hebrews 11:6 it says, and without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him. So it feels, oftentimes we say that when we have faith, that we are truly say, I have faith in God, only when the times are going great. But when the trials and the storms come in our life, just like with Abraham, I want to be the one controlling the steering wheel. I want to be the one controlling the wheel of the boat. But in all actuality, having faith means giving the wheel over to God. And you sit down on that boat and you row until your captain says that you've made it home, good and faithful servant. And so, the kingdom of God is not a matter of talk, but of power. You can't have faith only when the way is straight. You see, having faith is tough, and it will lead you down these sort of looping paths. And they sometimes just seem to be going in circles, and they double back on themselves. But having faith means that you know the straight and narrow path will always lead you back home, because you have God's word as a lamp unto your feet. And one theologian puts it like this: the life of the godly is not an interstate through Nebraska, but a state road through the Blue Ridge Mountains of Tennessee. There are rock slides and precipices and dark mists and bears and slippery curves and hairpin turns that make you go backwards in order to go forwards. But all along this hazardous, twisted road that doesn't let you see very far ahead, there are frequent signs that say, the best is yet to come. And so that is the path on our calling. The best is yet to come. Even when it seems like we're just going through the Blue Ridge Mountains of Tennessee, and we're just going through, and everything just seems to be going wrong, the best is yet to come. And you might remember there was the Olympics of 1998, and they were held in Nagano, Japan. And not many people remember the Winter Olympics. If you've forgotten, there was the Winter Olympics this year, if that's how fast 2018 has moved for you, if you've already forgotten that. And so in 1998, there were these Winter Olympics in Nagano, Japan. And you might remember that there was this one athlete named Bjorn Dali, and he was a skier for Norway. And he's sort of the greatest sort of cross-country skier in history. And he has several medals, several world championships, and he's one of the most decorated athletes in history. And if you sort of combine the Olympics and the World Championships, he's behind sort of Michael Phelps and sort of the most decorated athletes. And someone you might not remember from the 1998 Olympics is there was another skier that competed. And his name was Philip Voigt. And Philip Voigt you might not remember, but he was unique in those Olympics. And he had a little bit of a different background than Bjorn Daehlie. You see, Philip Voigt wanted to ski in the Olympics as well, but he had a little bit of a setback, a bit of a struggle. Philip Voigt was from the country of Kenya. And so he had only seen snow about 2 years prior from the Olympics, but Philip Voigt is a serious athlete. He's going to train and he's going to do the best he can. And so he begins to train for the Olympics, and he gets the opportunity to represent Kenya in the Olympics. And so he goes and he participates, and out of 92 competitors, Philip Voigt finished in a strong 92nd place. But in first place was Bjorn Daehlie. And Bjorn Daehlie won the gold medal, and he finished a whole 30 minutes before Philip Voigt. And so you might have watched the Olympics before. Usually when someone wins, that gold medal or even a silver or a bronze, they go and they run off and they celebrate with their camp or their family, their loved ones, because they've just, accomplished this great feat. But Bjorn Daehlie doesn't do that. He sits and he waits at the finish line. And he waits for Philip Voigt to get there. And when he gets there, he embraces him. And he says, "You could have stopped, but you didn't." And so to kind of wrap up, that little story, what makes it even greater is Philip Voigt, even later on in his life, he has this child, and he names him Bjorn Daehlie, after that man and that great impact that he had on him. And it's not really hard to explain sort of the meaning from that little story. You see, Jesus Christ is Bjorn Daehlie in that story. He's already at the finish line. He's already followed the calling back home. You see, the Lord Jesus is waiting on you, and He's already run the race. And no one will be able to run it like He did. No one will be able to set the record or the time that He did in that race. But Jesus Christ is waiting there at the finish line. And He wants to embrace you like those two skiers did. And He wants to say, "You finished strong. You could have quit, but you didn't. And I'm proud of you." And I think we will cherish those words for an eternity. So number 3, our calling will lead us to make tough decisions that don't seem to benefit us. Our calling will make us make tough decisions that don't seem to benefit us. Going back to Abraham, you have in chapter 13 of Genesis, you sort of had that moment of contention between him and Lot. And they had the fighting amongst their servants. And so Abraham and Lot come together, and Abraham says, "I don't want any quarrel among us. We're family. And so if you choose to go to the left, I'll go to the right. And if you choose to go to the right, I'll go to the left." And so Lot looks out into that land, and he sees the fertile land that surrounds Sodom and Gomorrah. And if you read there in the text, it compares it to the Garden of Eden. Now, I don't know if you've ever grown a garden before, if you've ever seen a nice forest, but it's pretty good if it's compared to the Garden of Eden. And so Lot looks out, and he chooses, of course, that I'm going to go with that land that looks like the Garden of Eden, and I'm going to pitch my tent there. And so Abraham had every right to make the first choice. He was the elder. He was the uncle to his nephew. He had every right to pick which land he wanted to go to. But he let Lot make the choice first. He let Lot make a choice that didn't seem to benefit Abraham. So oftentimes it seems like having faith in God sometimes doesn't always seem to benefit us. You see that oftentimes the most successful people that we see out in our culture and in popular culture in our lives today, they don't have a spiritual life to speak of. They don't have any sort of relationship with God, any sort of belief in God, and they are still successful. And they always seem to have a new car and the nicest house. And I'm sure you don't even have to think about celebrities. I'm sure you have coworkers. I'm sure you have friends. They don't have any sort of relationship with God, but they have a really nice car, a really nice house, a stable job with a good income. And they seem to always sort of come out on top. And they seem to always flourish while we are forced to watch them lead a luxurious lifestyle. And I'll tell you what making the right decision will actually get you when you are faced with a tough decision, and that's peace of mind. You see, a peace that surpasses all understanding. No man who has made the right decision for the right reasons will ever one day sit back and wonder, what if I could have made the other decision that benefited me the most and hurt others? You see, you have that moment with Abraham and Lot, and we can look back because we know the entire story. You see, in that moment, it looked like that land was a pretty great decision. It looked like pitching my tent, putting my family over there will seem to benefit me. But Abraham gave Lot that choice. And the Bible doesn't tell us, but maybe Abraham thought, well, that's near Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't want to go that way. But Lot chose that land even though Abraham had the right to choose first. Because we know, for what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his own soul? You see, God will keep His promise to bless you, just like He kept His promise to Abraham. You see, we have the end story to Lot there in that land. We know the outcome. We know what happens to him, that he needs sort of God through Abraham to bring that deliverance, to pull his family out of that wicked city. And so we know that sometimes those great decisions that seem wonderful and fantastic in the short end don't always work out in the long run. And so we know what happens. Lot has to abandon that territory, and he loses his wife because she looks back while the city's being destroyed. And so we know what happens to Lot. And so the easiest decisions will not always turn out to be the right decisions. You see, on our path back home, the easiest decisions, the shortcuts, will not always work out for you. You have to follow God's calling back home, and you have to rely on Him. There was this sort of motivational speaker, and his name was Zig Ziglar. And he tells this story about this economics professor who offered sort of this very peculiar exam at sort of a major university. And this test has several sections to it, and it had 3 categories. And so the first category was full of hard questions that were worth 50 points apiece. And the second category was full of these sort of medium-level difficulty questions. And in the last section, the third category was sort of these easy questions. And sort of in the directions on the test, it said, well, you only have to complete one section. And so most of you have been students before, you know which one you would pick. And so most of these students, they go right for those easy questions. And so they all turn in their papers for that test. And so when the students, they sort of get the test back pretty fast, and they see sort of a pattern when they get that test back. And that they notice that everyone who did the hard questions got A's. And everyone who did the medium questions got B's. And everyone who did the really easy question got C's. And the students were perplexed, and understandably they were a little bit confused, and because all the people who did the easy questions and got all of them right still got C's. And so they asked the professor, well, how did you grade this thing? What sort of, can we see a rubric or sort of your layout of how you graded this test? And he said it was really simple. I was not testing your knowledge. I was testing your aim. You see, God is testing our aim too. And He wants to see if we have enough faith in Him to trust in Him when in all honesty, it logically doesn't make sense on this earthly world. When in all honesty, and sort of logically, it makes sense to choose that land that looks like Eden. It makes sense to go that way. God is testing your aim if you will follow Him when it doesn't make logical sense. But you see, our God's strength and love goes beyond all logical comprehension. And so finally, our call will often lead us to make decisions we don't want to make. And you can see that in chapter 22 in the book of Genesis, and you see that at Abraham when he finally has that child of promise, when he finally has Isaac. And you think, this is it. This is the start of those promises. I'm going to have that great nation that God told me I'm going to have. that we're just going to be on that narrow road back home, and we're just going to be great and everything's going to be wonderful. But if, we have the whole story, and so God calls on Abraham to sacrifice his son, to sacrifice Isaac. And so Abraham, being the great man of faith that he was, even though this was a decision he didn't want to make, and he probably had some thoughts in his head that the Bible doesn't give us, it's like, I don't understand what we're doing here, but if God has called me to it, he can bring me through it. And so he brings Isaac, and he brings him up sort of the mountain, and he has all the materials that he needs. And Isaac even has that sort of question as he probably began to look around and see, where's the sacrifice? And he sort of begins to have that sort of moment. And Abraham says that God will provide for us. And so they get to that moment, and what happens? God provided for them. He provided that sacrifice. He was testing your faith on the road back to your calling. You see, God will test our faith too. And he will lead us to these parts in our lives where we'll have to make decisions that we don't really want to make. I'm sure many of you were tired. You had a long day at work, but you came here tonight and you might have the thought in the back of your head, I could stay home and get a nap in because I'm going to have a long day at work tomorrow. I have to cook dinner when I come back from church. I have all these errands I need to do that I don't want to have to take about an hour and a half out of my time when I could use it for other things. But God will test our faith and force us to make decisions that sometimes we don't want to make. But you have to make the right decision. God will call us to make the tough calls. God will call you to do something when you're tired, when you have work the next morning, when you have to still prepare dinner when you get home, when you have the errands you have to run. He will make us make the tough calls. And he will ask us if we value God over possessions, over our relationships with others. God asks the tough questions of us, so be prepared to give the tough answers. Be prepared to answer, do you serve God or do you serve man? And what will your answer be on your path home to your calling? Well, I can tell you tonight what Abraham's answer was. You see, Abraham didn't know sort of the end result of everything. He had to rely on that great faith, on that path to his calling, on the promises that he had. He had to believe that God would fulfill those promises. But we know the end to his story. We have Hebrews chapter 11. And Hebrews in chapter 11, starting in verse 8, it says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going, and by faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to that city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith Sarah herself received the power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they were seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of this land, of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offering be named. He considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. You see, Abraham provides an excellent example of how following your calling oftentimes will be difficult. And it may make you do things that you'd rather not. But in the end, it will be worth it. It will be so worth it. And so I can sort of close here tonight with sort of one final story. And you may have those doubts as you go on your calling. And this story is sort of that final charge of in those moments when you have that doubt. As when you're going on that road that sort of just doubles back on itself, and you sort of have that moment, well, didn't I see that tree or that sign before? And you seem to be wondering, have I been making the right decisions all along? And you have those moments just each and every day of your life, it sort of seems like. And so as we go on that calling, just remember this. In England, in the August of 1939, King George VI, he ordered what was called Operation Pied Piper, which was set in motion the day after they proclaimed it. And they evacuated all of the children and took them away from the bomb-torn areas of London. And so children by the thousands were flocked to these train stations, and they had these little tags on them that sort of looked like these suitcase tags you might have in your suitcase. And on these tags, it had their names and their addresses and who their parents were, and it had sort of their vital information on it. And many of these these children were chaperoned by their teachers, and they were brought to the train and sort of separated from their parents in that moment. And it's to my understanding that a quarter of the entire population was relocated. But at the first, the children were sort of boarded into the trains. They were moved to these safer parts of the country up north for World War II, because you're going to have these bomb-torn areas of London, and they moved them up north into Scotland. And one of the stories sort of emerging from this operation was of this little boy and his even younger little sister. And so they're getting on this train, and they have these little tags on, those little suitcase tags, and it has all their information on them. And then the little girl begins to cry. And she, as you might imagine, a young child wants her parents. She doesn't want to go and be forced to relocate somewhere else, to be forced to go away from her family. And she's crying, and her young brother, who's just a little bit older than her and sort of wiping away tears from his own eyes, goes up next to his sister, and he wipes away her tears, and he tells her, "I don't know where we're going either, but the King knows, so don't worry." And that's about the best answer I can offer you today. On your path, on your journey, a lot of times it won't seem to make sense on your calling back home to heaven. I don't know where your path will take you. I don't know what troubles you will have to overcome. I don't know what difficulties will come to you tonight or tomorrow. But the King knows, your heavenly King knows, so don't worry. Thank you for your time.